Walk into an Amish farmhouse kitchen in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and you might feel like you have stepped through a door in time. Walls lined with mason jars, a crock of fermenting cabbage on the counter, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a root cellar beneath the floorboards, cool and dark, holding potatoes and carrots through the cold months ahead. It looks unusual to most Americans, foreign even, old. But here is the thing most people have never considered. Only 3 or 4 generations ago, nearly every American family lived this way. The Amish did not preserve these practices because they were peculiar. They preserved them because those practices worked, and they never saw a reason to abandon them. What we are going to explore today is the story of how American food changed, dramatically, and in ways most of us have never fully examined. We will travel through roughly 100 years, one era at a time, and look honestly at what each period brought us, what we gained, and what quietly slipped away. This is not a story about villains, and it is not a story about perfection in the past. It is a story about trade-offs, and understanding those trade-offs may be one of the most important things you can do for your family today. Chapter 1: A World Without Refrigerators. The Root Cellar. Before grocery stores, before refrigerators, before even the icebox became common, nearly every rural American home had a root cellar. Cut into the earth beneath the house or dug into the side of a hill, the root cellar used the constant temperature of the ground itself to preserve food. In most of the continental United States, that means a stable temperature of around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cool enough to slow the growth of bacteria, but not cold enough to freeze what was stored there. What went in? Potatoes, carrots, turnips, beets, winter squash, cabbages, apples, pears, onions, garlic, crocks of fermented vegetables, lard sealed in stoneware jars. A well-stocked root cellar in October could feed a family through April. That was not a luxury, that was survival. The Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, still maintain root cellars today, not as a quaint nod to tradition, but because they work. They require no electricity, no compressor, no refrigerant, just earth and knowledge. The icebox era. By the mid-1800s, urban households had access to something that seemed miraculous at the time: ice. Ice harvested from frozen ponds and rivers in winter, packed in sawdust, shipped on barges and rail cars, delivered to city doorsteps by the iceman, and placed in an insulated wooden cabinet we called the icebox. The icebox was not terribly efficient by modern standards. Ice melted, temperatures fluctuated, food spoiled faster than we would like today, but it represented the first real attempt to bring cold preservation into the home. Here is something that might surprise you. As late as 1920, only about 18% of American homes had access to mechanical refrigeration. The vast majority of American families were still relying on iceboxes, root cellars, fermentation, drying, smoking, and salting to keep food safe. The fermentation kitchen. This one may be the most important moment in this entire story. Before refrigerators, lacto-fermentation was not a health trend. It was not something people read about in wellness magazines. It was a necessity. When you cannot reliably keep food cold, you preserve it by making it acidic. Beneficial bacteria consume sugars, produce lactic acid, and create an environment where harmful pathogens simply cannot survive. This is why sauerkraut existed, why pickles existed, why cultured dairy existed, why sourdough bread existed, why chow chow, relishes, and fermented bean dishes were staples across American culture. Sauerkraut, in particular, has roots in American history most people do not know. German and Eastern European immigrants brought fermentation traditions with them, and those traditions spread across rural America because they worked. A crock of properly fermented cabbage could last an entire winter without refrigeration. Modern microbiome research is now showing us something remarkable. Those traditional fermented foods were feeding trillions of beneficial bacteria in the human gut. NIH researchers studying the human microbiome have identified thousands of microbial species in the digestive system, many of which depend on fermented foods and dietary fiber to thrive. Our great-grandmothers did not know the word microbiome, but they were feeding theirs every single day without thinking about it. The Amish still do. The smokehouse and the salt box. Alongside fermentation, smoke and salt were the other great preservers. Nearly every farm in early America had a smokehouse, a small structure, often no larger than a garden shed, where hams, sausages, and fish hung in the dense antimicrobial smoke of hardwood fires for days, sometimes weeks. Smoking did more than add flavor. The natural compounds in wood smoke kill bacteria and mold on the surface of meat. The drying effect reduces the moisture that pathogens need to grow. A properly smoked ham could hang in a cool outbuilding and remain safe to eat for 6 months to a year. Salt curing worked on the same principle. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment too dry and too saline for bacteria to colonize. Salt cod, salt pork, and salt beef were staples of the American diet from the colonial era through the early 20th century. These were not primitive methods. They were elegant biological solutions to a real problem, developed over thousands of years of human trial and error. And they required nothing more than fire, salt, and skill. When food had seasons. Here is something that might seem obvious, but its implications go deeper than most people realize. 100 years ago, strawberries were a late spring event. Not a year-round item in the produce aisle. An event. Something people waited for. Something that signaled the turn of the season. Children would run to check the strawberry patch each morning to see if they had ripened yet. Watermelon was a summer fruit. Pumpkins and winter squash were fall. Apples came in late summer and autumn. Tomatoes in August. Sweet corn in July. Asparagus in early spring. Families did not eat with the seasons because it sounded romantic. They ate with the seasons because that was the only option. And that seasonal eating carried with it something we now know is nutritionally significant. Fruits and vegetables harvested at peak ripeness and eaten within days contain dramatically higher levels of certain vitamins, antioxidants, and phytonutrients than produce picked early and transported 2,000 miles. The 4th of July is not associated with watermelon by accident. It is associated with watermelon because, for most of American history, that was right around the time they were actually ripe. Pumpkins in October, apple cider in September, strawberries in June. The seasons shaped not just the kitchen, but the culture. Chapter 2. The Kitchen at the Crossroads. The first grocery stores. The modern grocery store as we know it did not exist before the early 20th century. Before that, Americans shopped at general stores, butchers, fishmongers, bakers, and farmers markets. They bought loose goods weighed out in front of them, wrapped in paper, and carried home in baskets. Many items were produced locally. The first self-service grocery store in the United States, Piggly Wiggly, opened in Memphis, Tennessee in 1917. Think about that for a second. In 1917, the idea of walking through a store and selecting your own items from a shelf was a novelty, a curiosity, something people came to experience simply because it was new. It seems almost impossible to imagine a world without the grocery store at the center of the food supply. But that world existed within living memory of people who are still alive today. The Wonder Bread era. In 1921, a baking company in Indianapolis introduced a new brand of commercially produced white bread. They called it Wonder Bread. In 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company of Missouri introduced the first commercially sliced bread. Within a decade, most of America had shifted away from home-baked bread towards soft, pre-sliced, commercially produced white loaves sold in wax paper wrappers. And here is where the story gets interesting. The original Wonder Bread formula was fairly simple: white flour, water, yeast, salt, a little sugar. Not terribly different from what a home baker might produce. The dramatic decline in nutritional value came gradually, over decades, as the formula was refined for shelf life, texture, and profitability. By the 1950s and 60s, commercial bread had begun absorbing artificial preservatives, emulsifiers, dough conditioners, and added vitamins to replace the nutrients stripped away by industrial milling. A slice of commercial white bread today contains up to 30 or more ingredients. A sourdough loaf baked in an Amish kitchen contains flour, water, salt, and a living culture that has been maintained for generations. That divergence happened in less than 50 years. The Great Depression Kitchen. The Great Depression of the 1930s reshaped American food culture in a way that tends to get overlooked. When the economy collapsed and unemployment reached nearly 25%, American families were forced back to skills they had only recently begun to abandon. Canning returned. Home gardens expanded. Families kept chickens in suburban backyards. They stretched every meal. They wasted nothing. Bean soups, bread puddings, pot liquor from boiled greens, bone broth long before the term bone broth was trendy. Every part of the animal, every scrap of vegetable, every bit of day-old bread found its way into something edible. The families who had maintained their grandmother's preservation skills survived the Depression better than families who had outsourced those skills entirely to the commercial food system. There is a lesson in that which is more relevant today than most people realize. Victory gardens. From 1942 to 1945, the United States government asked ordinary Americans to grow their own food. The response was extraordinary. At the peak of the Victory Garden movement, there were approximately 20 million home gardens across the United States, producing an estimated 9 to 10 million tons of vegetables. That represented roughly 40% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the country during those years. 20 million gardens. People grew food in backyards, window boxes, schoolyards, church lots, and city parks. Children gardened. Elderly neighbors gardened. Apartment dwellers found roof space and balconies and planted seeds in whatever containers they could find. And it worked. Not just nutritionally, it built a sense of competence, community, and connection to food that carried meaning beyond calories. The Victory Garden movement ended when the war ended. Most of those gardens disappeared within a few years, but the people who tended them never forgot what it felt like to grow something from seed and eat it. Many of them became the grandparents who kept a small vegetable patch decades later, long after it was necessary. Chapter 3. The Great Convenience Revolution. The refrigerator comes home. The refrigerator did not appear suddenly. Electric home refrigerators had existed since the 1920s, but they were expensive, unreliable, and accessible only to the affluent. After World War II, everything changed. Returning veterans bought houses in new suburbs. Factories that had produced war equipment converted to consumer appliances. Prices dropped, credit became available, and the refrigerator became a symbol of American prosperity and modernity. By 1956, roughly 80% of American homes had a mechanical refrigerator. That is one of the most rapid adoptions of a household technology in human history. And with the refrigerator came something that seems unremarkable now, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time: the ability to keep food cold indefinitely at any time of year, without ice delivery, without a root cellar, without fermentation. Preservation skills that had been practiced for thousands of years of human history became optional, almost overnight. Nobody called that a loss at the time. Why would they? The refrigerator was miraculous. It reduced foodborne illness. It saved time. It made life easier in very real ways. But when a skill becomes optional, it often disappears within a generation. The birth of the TV dinner. On November 8, 1953, Swanson Foods introduced a product called the TV dinner. It was a complete meal, already cooked, frozen in an aluminum tray with separate compartments, sold for 98 cents. Turkey, cornbread dressing, gravy, and sweet potatoes. All you did was put it in the oven for 25 minutes. In its first year, Swanson sold 10 million TV dinners. The TV dinner was not just a convenience. It was a cultural signal. It said, eating does not have to involve cooking. The kitchen does not have to be the center of the home. Mealtime can be passive, individual, and separate from the act of food preparation. Within 15 years, the frozen food aisle had become a fixture in every supermarket. Within 30 years, the microwave made even the oven optional. Within 50 years, Americans were spending more money eating food prepared outside the home than food prepared inside it. That entire trajectory began with a 98-cent aluminum tray in 1953. The supermarket transformation. The supermarket of the 1950s looks almost nothing like what we know today. Early supermarkets were modest by modern standards, perhaps 10,000 square feet, a few thousand products, mostly whole ingredients: flour, sugar, canned goods, fresh produce, dairy, meat. Today, a standard American supermarket carries 40 to 50,000 different products. Many of them have no analog in human food history. Multi-ingredient, shelf-stable products engineered for palatability, visual appeal, and extended shelf life. The transformation happened gradually, but the direction was consistent, from whole ingredients toward assembled products, from the kitchen as a place of skill toward the grocery cart as the primary site of food decision-making. An Amish woman in Arthur, Illinois, carries a basket through a farmer's market once a week and brings home ingredients. She then turns those ingredients into meals. A typical American family navigates thousands of options in a single shopping trip, most of which require no cooking at all, just heating. Neither lifestyle is morally superior, but they produce very different relationships to food. The end of home canning. Perhaps nothing illustrates the great convenience shift more clearly than what happened to home canning. At the peak of the Victory Garden era, an estimated 75% of American households canned or preserved some of their own food at home. By 1970, that number had fallen to less than 30%. By 2000, less than 10%. For most of human history, the ability to preserve food was a fundamental household skill, like knowing how to cook or sew. It was passed from grandmother to daughter as a matter of course. Within 30 years, it became a hobby, something practiced by enthusiasts, something that required a tutorial because there was no longer a grandmother to teach it. Skills that took generations to develop and refine can disappear in a single generation when they are no longer needed. Chapter 4. When food became a product. The sweet deception. In 1971, a Japanese researcher developed a process for converting glucose from cornstarch into fructose. The result was a sweetener cheaper to produce than cane sugar with a longer shelf life that blended more easily into beverages and packaged foods. High fructose corn syrup entered the American food supply in the mid-1970s. By 1980, it appeared in soft drinks. By 1990, it was in bread, condiments, yogurt, cereal, sauces, salad dressings, canned soups, and infant formula. American consumption of added sugars climbed dramatically during this period. For context, in the early 1800s, the average American consumed roughly 6 to 8 pounds of sugar per year. By the early 2000s, that figure had climbed to over 100 pounds by most estimates. Our great-grandparents sweetened things with honey, molasses, and maple syrup in modest quantities because those sweeteners were expensive and labor-intensive to produce. The Amish still reach for honey and maple syrup first, not because of a health philosophy, because that is what was always in the pantry. The oil in the machine. Here is one of the most significant and most quietly consequential shifts in the entire American food supply. Before the 20th century, Americans cooked primarily in animal fats: lard, tallow, butter, bacon fat saved in a jar beside the stove. These fats had sustained human populations for thousands of years. They are stable at high temperatures. They contain fat-soluble vitamins, and the body has well-established metabolic pathways for processing them. Beginning in the early 1900s, industrial processes made it possible to extract and refine oil from seeds and plants at enormous scale. Cottonseed oil, soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil. These seed oils were initially marketed as healthier alternatives to animal fats. The science behind that claim has been significantly complicated in the decades since. Modern nutritional researchers are actively investigating the relationship between the dramatic rise in seed oil consumption and parallel increases in inflammatory conditions. This remains an area of genuine scientific debate, but the shift itself is not debated. In 1900, Americans consumed almost no seed oils. Today, soybean oil alone accounts for roughly 7% of all calories consumed in the United States. That is a change without precedent in human dietary history. The low-fat myth. In the early 1980s, the United States government published dietary guidelines advising Americans to dramatically reduce their consumption of fat. What happened next was one of the most significant unintended consequences in the history of public health. Food manufacturers reformulated thousands of products to reduce fat content. Fat carries flavor, so when fat came out, sugar went in. Low-fat cookies, fat-free yogurt, reduced-fat salad dressings loaded with corn syrup and modified food starch. Americans ate less fat and consumed more added sugar than at any point in history. Between 1976 and 2000, the obesity rate in the United States roughly doubled. The low-fat dietary guidelines were significantly revised beginning in the early 2000s. By 2015, they had been fundamentally reconsidered, but eating patterns, once established, are slow to shift. The ultra-processed threshold. In a landmark 2019 study published in the journal Cell Metabolism, NIH researchers found something striking. When people were offered ultra-processed food versus minimally processed food with the same available calories, those eating the ultra-processed diet consumed an average of 500 additional calories per day. They did not eat more because they were less disciplined. They ate more because ultra-processed foods are specifically engineered to override the body's natural satiety signals. By 2020, multiple nutritional surveys suggested that ultra-processed foods accounted for roughly 50 to 60% of the average American's daily caloric intake. Food researchers at the University of Sao Paulo developed a classification system called NOVA to describe this category. Products formulated from industrial ingredients with no equivalent in a home kitchen. Hydrogenated fats, modified starches, artificial colorings, flavor enhancers, emulsifiers. Products engineered for extreme palatability and shelf stability. Our great-grandparents would not have recognized most of what is in a modern grocery store as food. That is not an exaggeration. It is simply true. Chapter 5. What we lost along the way. Before the mid-20th century, physical movement was not something people had to schedule. It was unavoidable. Hauling water, cutting firewood, tending a garden, washing clothes by hand, kneading bread, walking to the store, walking to the neighbor's farm. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer populations estimate that pre-agricultural humans walked 12 to 15,000 steps per day as a baseline of daily life. Early American farmers likely moved at similar levels during working seasons. Today, the average American logs fewer than 5,000 steps per day. We invented the Apple Watch to remind us to stand up. Our ancestors would not have understood that concept. The Amish walk an average of 14,000 to 18,000 steps per day, simply as a function of how their lives are organized, not because they exercise, because their work demands it. There is something else that lived inside those traditional food practices that does not show up in a nutritional analysis. The barn raising, the canning bee, the church supper, the harvest festival. Food preservation was never a solitary activity in Amish communities or in traditional American farm culture. It was communal. Families came together to put up tomatoes. Neighbors helped with butchering. Women gathered for pie making before community events. The act of preparing food together built relationships. It transmitted knowledge. It created a sense of shared competence and interdependence that modern life has largely dissolved. We now eat mostly alone or in front of screens. We prepare food sometimes from kits designed to minimize the skill required. We buy most of our meals pre-made from people we will never meet, in kitchens we will never see, using processes we cannot describe. That severance from food production is historically extraordinary, and it carries consequences that extend well beyond nutrition. Something was lost between the generation that canned tomatoes as a matter of course and their grandchildren who are now watching videos trying to learn what their great-grandmothers did without thinking. Not just skills, confidence. A woman who grew up watching her mother make sourdough bread approaches a loaf of bread with a fundamentally different mindset than someone who has never seen the process. She knows what the dough should feel like. She knows when to add more flour. She knows what the yeast smells like when it is active. That embodied knowledge, passed through demonstration and repetition across generations, is extraordinarily difficult to recover from a book or a video. We are not just a society that lost recipes. We are a society that lost the confidence that comes from knowing how to feed yourself. The sourdough revival. Something unexpected happened during the pandemic lockdowns of 2020. People baked bread. Flour and yeast disappeared from store shelves. Home bakers shared recipes online. Sourdough starter was traded between neighbors like contraband. Millions of people who had never baked anything more complex than a boxed brownie found themselves learning to manage a living culture of wild yeast. Sourdough starter sales were up over 300% in March of 2020. King Arthur Flour's website received more visitors than ever in its history. People were not just baking, they were reclaiming something. The sourdough trend did not evaporate when the lockdowns ended. Many of those bread bakers kept going. They got into fermenting, into canning, into gardening, into chicken keeping. A skill, once discovered, tends to want company. The backyard revolution. The number of American households growing some of their own food has climbed steadily since the early 2000s. By 2020, estimates suggest that roughly 35% of American households were growing food in some form. Backyard chickens are now legal in most major American cities. Flock permits have increased in cities like Denver, Portland, and Seattle by over 100% in the past 15 years. Seed sales have climbed. Canning jar manufacturers have reported shortages in multiple years since 2020 due to demand. Farmers market attendance has increased in nearly every region of the country. Younger Americans, particularly those in the 25 to 45 age range, are driving much of this growth. They are not driven by nostalgia. They did not grow up doing this. They are driven by something else entirely, a desire for competence in a world that increasingly feels out of their control. A desire to know where their food comes from. A desire to feed their families something they made themselves. They are, without quite realizing it, rediscovering what the Amish never abandoned. Walk into that Lancaster County farmhouse kitchen again. The mason jars are still there. The crock of sauerkraut is still fermenting on the counter. The dried herbs hang from the rafters. The root cellar is full. The woman in that kitchen is not living in the past. She is living in a version of the present that most Americans have simply forgotten was ever possible. She knows how to feed her family through a winter without a supermarket. She knows how to preserve the summer harvest and make it last until spring. She knows how to bake bread from a culture she maintains herself. She knows how to put up 60 quarts of tomatoes in a single weekend and stack them on shelves that will carry her family through the following August. That knowledge is not old-fashioned. It is resilient. And resilience is something a growing number of Americans are beginning to understand they desperately want. The story of how American food changed in 100 years is not simple. We gained genuine miracles. Refrigeration reduced foodborne illness that once killed thousands every year. Industrial food production ended famine in the developed world. Modern agriculture yields more food per acre than any point in human history. The time liberated from constant food preservation opened space for education, careers, and lives that previous generations could not have imagined. Those are real gains, worth honoring. But every trade comes with a price, and we are now, as a society, beginning to honestly reckon with what that price has been. We traded fermented foods for processed ones, whole ingredients for assembled products, seasonal eating for year-round abundance. Animal fats our grandparents understood for oils from plants they would not have recognized. Home-baked bread for shelves of ingredients we cannot pronounce. Grandmother's kitchens for delivery apps and frozen meals. And somewhere in that exchange, we traded a certain kind of competence. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing how to feed yourself and the people you love with your own hands, from ingredients you understand. That confidence is not lost. It is waiting. In the garden you could plant this spring. In the canning jars that could line your shelves by fall. In the sourdough starter that could sit on your counter and become bread every week. In the fermented vegetables that could become a staple in your family's kitchen the way they were in your great-grandmother's. The Amish did not save these practices for us. They saved them for themselves because they work. But the fact that they kept going while the rest of the country changed its mind means the thread is still there, still intact. You can pick it back up. You always could. Until next time, keep it frugal, keep it simple, and keep it homemade.